Welcome back to Passionately Catholic. We're going to take a look in a very short series here that actually adds on to the series we were doing about evidence for God's existence. A lot of times I think atheists tend to poke holes in theist theories. So a lot of times their argument back will be this, is that the assumption should be that there is no God. Like the burden of proof, the evidence needs to be provided by the theists, the believers in God. Now, this is really fascinating because prior to Antony Flew, who spent 50 plus years being a professional atheist philosopher who then converted to belief in God and addressed that in his book, There Is a God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind, which I did a previous video on in the series on evidence for God's existence. Antony Flew actually argued with his doctoral dissertation at Oxford, where he studied where C.S. Lewis was at the time, and he argued against C.S. Lewis. Antony Flew made this first big prominent argument in his doctoral dissertation that the burden of proof actually rests on the theists. Okay, so this is so funny because more than 50, 60 years later now, we have atheists who are still leaning on that same argument of Antony Flew, that the burden of proof is on the theists. And yet, Antony Flew changed his mind after over 50 years of being a professional atheist. So take a look possibly up here for the link to that video to check that out. So today we're going to deal with what I've run into is probably the primary argument against God's existence that an atheist would propose, and it's known as the problem of evil, okay, or the problem of pain, or the problem of suffering. Okay, so the problem of evil can be stated in a variety of ways, but one way is that if there is this all-good, all-powerful God, and this God is all-loving, okay, he's all good, he's benevolent, and he's all-powerful, he's omnipotent, he can do anything, then how is it possible that evil, pain, suffering exists in the world? And sometimes an atheist will argue these four things are incompatible. You cannot have a God who is all good, who's all-powerful, and still have evil exist, because if that God does exist and he's all good, then he wouldn't want us to suffer. So he would take away the evil and pain and suffering that we experience, okay? So he must not be all-powerful. Or maybe there's a God and that God is all-powerful, but he's not all good, and he's willing to have us suffer. He wants us to be in pain and suffering and all, those kinds of things, suffer from evil. So he allows evil, pain, and suffering to exist. So, they'll propose, this doesn't disprove God completely. This argument it would just possibly limit God's power, or the appearance of God's power. So let's take a look at this argument from evil, and a way that theists, we ask this question as well. The way that we tend to ask this question is, why do bad things happen to good people? Why do bad things happen to good people? Okay, so let's wrestle with this. Now, evil, pain, and suffering, I think, come from two sources within the world. Source number one would be from sin. You see, I hurt me through my own sin. I hurt you through my sin. You hurt me through your sin. We hurt each other through our own sins. Okay, so the reality is that some of the evil and pain and suffering that we experience in this life is the result of doing the wrong thing, of sinning, of me hurting you, you hurting me, we hurt each other, etc. Okay? So why doesn't God just make human beings who are incapable of sin? So that way we would stop hurting ourselves and stop hurting each other. Wouldn't that be brilliant, right? God just do this. So here's the problem, okay? God can't. Now then you're like, well, wait a minute, maybe God isn't all-powerful. Well, hang on, okay, you got to be careful about this. God can't make a human, okay, without free will. To be a human being, we have to have free will, which means that we have the greatest power that a human can have, is to love. That's the greatest good that we could ever do, is to love another human being, to put them ahead of ourselves, to put their needs ahead of ourselves and make ourselves second or third or fourth, and to care for them and to love them unconditionally. But the greatest evil that we could do is sin, and free will allows that power. In order to be able to love, we have to be able to choose not to love the other person. That has to be an option on the table. Otherwise, we're completely required to love, and then it wouldn't be love. There's nothing sincere, there's nothing genuine about that at all. And God loves all of creation, but He loves us especially, made in His image and likeness, created in His image and likeness. So for us to love Him back, God has to give us free will to do this, right? Now, okay, their God is not all powerful. He can't do it. Well, hang on. There are things that are logically impossible that God nor anything else, it's not even logically possible. It's absurd. It's like saying that, well, God is not omnipotent. If there is a God, God is not omnipotent. He's not all powerful because he can't make a three-sided circle, okay? Or he can't make, a four-sided triangle or something like that. Okay, those are logical absurdities. Okay, so that does not limit God's omnipotence in any way, shape, or form. And the reality about our sin and the sin that causes evil, pain, and suffering in the world is that we have to have it because we need that free will so that we can be a human being, so we're able to love. Okay, so that we're not some kind of robot or animal or something like that lacks free will. To be human is to have free will and to be able to love. And I would even argue that if we lost that free will, that would take away one of the greatest things about being a human being. And then people are like, well, why doesn't God just prevent people from doing really bad stuff? Why doesn't he give us free will but prevent us from doing true evils? Okay, now it's a mystery that God would allow certain evils to take place in our world. But on the other hand, we've also got to ask the question, well, are we asking God to just do everything that I want to do and not realize that we're just a creature and that God has an infinite understanding of the universe? Are we expecting, every time a human being falls from a height above 1 story, are we expecting God to prevent that person from hitting the ground? Like maybe the human being would fall and then they would gradually decelerate, okay, and then touch the ground very gently, okay? Well, if that actually happened, if every time a human being fell from a 4-story building, okay, or a 12-story building or 1-story building, that they gradually decelerated and then landed gently, but a cat didn't, or an apple didn't, or a pumpkin didn't, okay, then physics wouldn't even work, okay? I mean, the sciences wouldn't even be understandable. It wouldn't be repeatable. It's like, well, it would be repeatable, but why does this not happen with a human, but it does happen with something else? See, the reality is evil, pain, and suffering exist in this world because we can cause a lot of it, but also because the world is broken. That when sin enters the world, there's a brokenness to all of it. That original sin causes human beings to die. That was not part of God's original plan. And thanks be to God, He's sent His Son Jesus Christ to offer us the opportunity of eternal life. Okay, so we can still be saved. So you can even tie back other evils that we experience, the brokenness of creation, back to original sin, because there's a rebellion, if you will, amongst the world, the earth of nature, if you will, against the sinfulness of humanity, from what we're told from sacred scripture. But the atheist isn't going to like that at all. If you don't believe in God, that argument isn't going to impress you whatsoever, which is totally fine. Okay, so let's look at the second cause for evil, pain, and suffering in our world. First one is sin, that I hurt me, I hurt you, you hurt me, we hurt each other. But the second one is that the natural world involves pain and suffering, basically. Evil probably isn't a fair thing to throw out here, but pain and suffering can definitely come from the natural world itself. So for example, floods, droughts, earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis, the works. Okay, floods, strong winds, tornadoes. I live in the Midwest. We see our fair share of tornadoes. Okay, hurricanes, all that kind of stuff, right? So somebody can say, well, gosh, why couldn't God have made a world that was perfect, where it was 72 degrees all the time and, it's just lovely, didn't rain, anything like that? Well, here's the issue. As soon as you put something in motion you can actually say, God did create it that way. That would have been the Garden of Eden, and what messed that up? We did. We got booted out of the Garden of Eden because we decided to sin. So then you go back to the whole free will thing, and you're back to sin all over again. Okay, but fine. We don't have to go that direction. But look at the natural world. Anytime you put something in motion, in the natural world, it has the possibility of colliding with something else or rubbing up against something else, and that can cause pain. For example, walking through my bedroom and clipping my toe on the foot of my bed, if anything's in motion, it can clip into something else. Now, the reality of nature on Earth is that we have to have things in motion for life to exist. Just consider one example, the water cycle. For water has to be in motion. It has to evaporate. It needs to blow on the winds. It needs to move. It needs to condense, and it needs to fall. That has to happen. So even in the perfect scenario, Eden, if you will, you're going to have some rain, and everybody has their different preference. I actually like snow here in Iowa. I don't like too much, but I certainly I love skiing, downhill skiing. So everybody's preference of what would not cause them pain pain and suffering would be totally different. Some people would like some cold, some wouldn't. Okay, so then it becomes this radically subjective mess, right? Like how are you going to have this perfect Earth? Okay, so fine, back to the water cycle. Things have to be in motion. So somebody could simply say, well, then why does God allow it to get so excessive? Okay, why wouldn't God just keep everything much more moderate? So you always have a gentle moving of various things. Okay, could he have created that way? Well, again, we can argue that he did. That is what Eden would have been like. And again, who messed that up? We did. Okay, but God doesn't want to leave us in this condition. He provides the opportunity for salvation for all of us. Another example of the natural world, like people might say, well, what about cancer? Okay, and I get it. This is a plague on modern society, dealing with cancer. My daughter is a cancer survivor. She was diagnosed with leukemia when she was 3 years old. So I don't take this subject lightly. I've touched on this in past videos, and I don't take the subject and the suffering and the pain involved with this lightly whatsoever. But let's consider this for a moment. The world, okay, the Earth has a metal core, iron nickel core that is spinning, rotating, and this creates the magnetic fields around the Earth, and the magnetic fields create the Van Allen belts, the magnetic field belts that go around the Earth, and these magnetic fields are essential to protect us from bombardment of solar radiation. Okay, and you can actually, for example, the northern lights and the southern lights, we see these because the Earth has these invisible belts which are magnetic. They're magnetic fields going around the Earth. Okay, and they're tilted, of course, because the Earth is tilted. The poles are tilted 23.5 degrees. So you've got these Van Allen belts coming out like a big donut, if you will, all the way around the Earth. Now, when solar radiation comes along, it can strike it can be, hit these belts head on. Then it's not going to be such an issue. But especially when it hits up at the top or the bottom, it can ride these belts, if you will. That energy can ride the belts down and come toward the poles, and then it can make contact with gases on the north and south poles and illuminate them like a neon light, right? The neon light is going to have electricity illuminate the gas, the colors of the gases in the neon light. Same thing happened. This is the northern and southern lights, the aurora borealis up here up north that we experience. If you're far enough north, you can see this. In Iowa, you don't see this as much unless there's a really big solar storm. So there's enough energy to go ride down those Van Allen belts, if you will, and push further south so that it's visible from where I'm at in Iowa. Okay, now, why need this? Okay, you need this to protect us from excessive solar radiation. So we get some radiation, for example, that will help mutations take place, that will allow evolution to work, but not an excess of radiation, because that would cause mutations to happen way too quickly, destabilized, and then you'd have way too much cancer and way too many problems. So we get a little bit better of a balance. Okay, more of this, Goldilocks zone, not too hot, not too cold, like things are working well on Earth. Okay, now you can always argue, well, life evolved so that would just plain work anyway. Okay, well, things can shift and you can get all kinds of problems related to this, but what this goes back to is the intelligent designer argument for God, that God designed everything with a purpose. Okay, so and that's another video that we've covered previously in terms of the evidence for God's existence. So to review here, and in terms of going forward as well, we're going to continue to look at evil, pain, and suffering and like its reality, regardless of how you try to explain it or how you work with it or whatever, what you believe, not believe about God, God exists or God doesn't exist. How do we deal with it? Okay, and there's also a lot of really valuable spiritual ways of looking at how to deal with the evil, pain, and suffering that we experience. But for the sake of summing up this video, our experience of evil, pain, and suffering, I would argue, comes from two sources: sin, and we have to have that because we need to have free will, and it also comes from the natural world. And for the natural world to work the way that we know it does, okay, for it to work as we know it, you have to have things in motion. You have to have a water cycle. Well, that can cause pain and suffering because of things getting out of balance or being excessive in terms of that water cycle, even just moving at all. Okay, to get the Van Allen belts, you have to have plate tectonics. You have to have an Earth with a spinning iron nickel core, if you will, a dense metal core, and then you've got to have the mantle and your crust. So because to get that protection from the sun, now you're going to get earthquakes and you're going to get volcanoes. Okay, so there's a little bit of a trade-off in terms of how life works on our planet. Okay, is that anything in motion can cause pain and suffering, and there's no way, even logically speaking, there's no way to avoid that. Like there's no way to make a four-sided triangle or a circular square. Okay, there's just that's a logical impossibility. If this video was useful to you, please like this video and be sure to subscribe to our channel so that you won't miss any of our future content. Be sure to share this with friends who you know could benefit from this, and a special thank you goes out to our patrons, especially on Patreon, who help make everything we do here at Passionately Catholic possible. I wish you God's abundant blessings and peace, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.